All right, Isaiah 65. It's been way too long since I've said God is amazing. Let's, however, call this chapter new, understanding that the next two chapters are going to talk about the ways in which in chapter 65, God is going to create a new heaven and a new earth. Going on in chapter 6 to talk about the way in which he is likewise creating a new Jerusalem to last as long as that new heaven and new earth, that being forever. Understanding that, chapter 65 is generally going to break down as a chapter in which he is going to describe himself as reaching out to a people who flat out rejected him. However, in addition to rejecting him, they are going to have provoked him. He is going to repay their provocation, but he is not going to make a complete end to them the way he did Sodom and Gomorrah, even though the prophet Ezekiel is going to liken them to Sodom and Gomorrah. He is, however, going to leave them a remnant, similar to what we saw in the earliest chapters of Isaiah. And for that remnant, he is going to seem to create the new heaven and the new earth, thus the title. However, breaking the chapter down in a little bit more detail, verse 1 is going to talk about the way in which he was ready to be sought by those who did not ask for him. Verse 2 going on to talk about the way in which he reached out his hands all the day to a rebellious people in verses 2 through 4, going on to talk about the way in which it wasn't enough for them to be rebellious. They went further and provoked God in verses 5 through roughly 6, maybe even 7, as he's going to go on to talk about the way in which he repaid them in verses 6 and 7, verses 8 through 10, going on to talk about the way in which his repayment does not completely get rid of them, as we said, leaving them a remnant. Going on to compare, in much the same way the Proverbs compared the righteous to the wicked, he's going to start out with a general comparison between the remnant and the rest, going on, though, to make itemized comparisons between the blessings awaiting the remnant and the misery essentially waiting the rest. Understanding that by the time we get to verse 17, he's going to talk about the place in which he seems to be ready to put that remnant. In some ways, reminding me of the original creation story where he put Adam in the garden, describing so much of it as good, ending up describing the creation of man as very good, but never describing it as perfect. Understanding that when the Christ came, one of the first things he did in the Sermon on the Mount is elevate the standard, talking about the ways in which whatever the standard was before, he is now calling us to perfection, because it seems that he is now trying to perfect a place for us to rest. Understanding that, verse 17 through the end of the chapter, verse 25, are going to describe in some detail the new heaven and the earth, with a shout out to the new Jerusalem, which he's going to talk about in more detail in chapter 66. Both chapters seeming to be similar to Revelation 21, that also gives a description of the new heaven, the new earth, and the new Jerusalem. However, here, the verse that talks about the new Jerusalem, verse 18, is going to describe Jerusalem this way: I create Jerusalem to be a joy and her people to be a gladness, as he is going to detail what that is going to look like. In addition to, I guess, generally to the description of what it's going to be like in the new heaven and the new earth. However, closing out the chapter, he is going to talk about in verses 24 and 25, the way in which, in comparison to the uncertainty of previous chapters, where the things that got them carted off into captivity are going to leave them uncertain about how long this is going to last. It's going to talk about the way in which, before they even call, he will answer, as opposed to the times when they called and wondered, when was their suffering going to end? In addition to that, it's going to end up this chapter, not just this chapter, but the entire book of Isaiah, in much the same way the book started, in one of the messianic prophecies, especially or specifically in chapter 11, where verse 25 here reads, the wolf and the lamb shall graze together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox, and dust shall be the serpent's food. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. Similar to chapter 2. chapter 9, and as we said, almost literally from chapter 11. The thing that quite possibly caught my attention most coming from verse 16, describing the one who is making all this possible this way, so that he who blesses himself in the land shall bless himself by the God of truth. And he who takes an oath in the land shall swear by the God of truth, because the former troubles are forgotten and are hidden from my eyes. Understanding that verse reminded me of the saying in our courts, you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I thought it was just stated redundantly for emphasis, but the older I got, the more I realized when somebody helped open my eyes to the concept that the truth is nothing if you don't have the whole truth, and it's likewise nothing if you're adding stuff to it. And so the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth is talking about the truth without subtractions or additions. And so we're talking about the God who is creating a new environment for us all. It likewise, as we have talked about in the chapters that remind us that we will not be saved on our own terms, it would likewise be good for us to understand the environment that he is creating for us. And while we have time, to ask him to help us get fully prepared for a place of the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Reminding me even more of how that process is not necessarily easy. Understanding that I talked with a sister not too long ago, telling her that there are times when I'll put certain things on other people when I'm giving illustrations, meaning I try my best to give credit and take responsibility. And so there are times when I am using illustrations where I will change the names to protect the innocent, and even more so sometimes the guilty. But it is similar to what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 6, when he says, I have applied all these things to myself and Apollos for your benefit, brothers, that you may learn by us not to go beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up in favor of one against the other. Of course, that concluding a section where he uses himself and Apollos as an example of the danger of rivalry amongst, in this case, it seems to be preachers. But understanding that I still need God's help in not going too far in my illustrations, going beyond, like Paul said, what is written. And so as we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. That God help us get ready once again to be a great fit in a place of the truth.